Hello there, everyone, and welcome. My name is Victoria Thompson, and I'm a founding member of the CFA UK Inclusion and Diversity Network Committee, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. We're joined by 4 distinguished panelists who are going to be sharing their insights with us today on the topic of driving diversity, equity and inclusion within financial services organisations. And really they're going to focus on, sharing their insights, providing some practical tips on how you yourselves can drive change within your organisations, and kind of pointing out some of the pitfalls and things to be aware of. So to briefly introduce our speakers, we have Noreen Biddle Shah. Noreen is the head of marketing and communications at Numis and the founder of Reboot. Reboot is a think tank and network of senior professionals who work together to continue the dialogue on race and racial equity in the UK workplace, and that has a particular focus. That discussion has a particular focus on financial services. We then have Leanne Mair. Leanne is Managing Director and Co-founder of Benefactum Consulting, a management consultancy company specialising in helping financial services organisations take action with respect to their commitments to gender equality. We then have Dominie, founder and Managing Director at the Return Hub, a search consultancy that places professionals who want to relaunch or transfer careers within the financial services sector. And then we have Mark Freed, co-founder of E2W Services, an organisation that focuses on supporting and helping women in with their financial services careers, and also working with institutions to attract, recruit and retain them. And Mark also launched Men for Inclusion in 2021, focused on helping men within the industry become advocates for inclusion. So welcome to you all. We're very much looking forward to hearing your insights. Just one small item of housekeeping. If people do have questions, please utilise the Q&A box. I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the discussion, and looking to weave in any questions that may come through there. So without further ado, if we move into the sort of first question, Dominie, I'll put this one to you in the first instance, please, and that's how does the financial services sector perform with respect to D&I, and kind of how is it kind of positioned currently, would you say?
Hi, Victoria, and thanks very much for having me here on the panel today. So I think the financial services sector, there's been an awful lot of pressure, a lot of that coming from government and policy, on getting the financial services sector to do a lot more. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of setting of targets, there is a lot of activity, although I think progress has been relatively slow. So despite the fact there's a lot of good work going on, I think when we look at some of the, my focus obviously at the Return Hub is recruitment, and within that we have a very specific focus on gender and women. Women make up about 80% of our candidate population. I think if we look at the Women in Finance Charter annual review for 2020, there was on average a 32% female representation in senior management amongst the Charter participants, but that showed an increase of less than 1 percentage point each year from when the Charter started in 2017. So I think there is clearly a lot more work to do. But the data, as I say, doesn't really reflect some of the good work that's been done by individual organisations. And
thank you very much, Dominie. And Mark, and anything that you would add to that there?
Yeah, Victoria, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Yeah, I think we can look at the stats of the Women in Finance Charter, but also if you look at gender pay gap stats, which perhaps give a more normalised and more transparent view into how the industry is progressing, there are, by certain measures, probably in a lot of firms, fewer women working in top quartile earning roles today than when gender pay gap reporting started in 2017. The actual pay gap, so the average pay of women has only closed on men by a couple of pence in those 4 years. And the bonus gaps are still above 50 50p in the pound or below 50p in the pound. So, yes, there's a lot of good talk and a lot of good initiatives, a lot of good effort happening, but actually progress is still glacially slow.
Thank you. That's some sobering statistics. And Noreen, could you give us some colour on that from your perspective as well, please?
Yeah, from a race and ethnicity perspective, I think the issue is generally that lack of any available data. And without that data, it's hard to measure any form of progress. So if you look at the UK more widely, ethnic minorities will represent 14% of the UK population, and we know 6% of them will make it to senior positions within the workplace, so it's not representative. But when you look at board levels, for example, our understanding was from some anecdotal feedback, there was zero representation from anyone Black that was at a board level. That may have changed incrementally, but not a lot. And I think that's why, from a Reboot perspective, we decided to commission a survey, which was race to equality within UK financial services at the back end of last year, just to get a pulse of what's going on. So we spoke to 800 employees, of which 600 were ethnic minorities, representing 440 UK financial services firms. And the results were pretty sobering, where we found 2/3 of those ethnic minorities respondents said they've experienced some form of discrimination in their organisation as a result of their background. Only 1/3 of all the respondents felt like their companies were truly committed to diversity and inclusion. I think most worryingly for me was almost half of the ethnic minorities that responded to the survey said that their career progression has been slower than that of their white colleagues. But if you ask the white colleagues the same question, 10% would say that their career has been slower than that of their ethnic minority colleagues. So I think it's fair to say there is a long way to go for financial services, and with the lack of any form of measurability, etc., it's really hard to gauge whether the statistics I'm giving you are even better off than last year or previous years. But I think the good news is we're going to start doing this every year, so at least we've got some sort of a pulse to see what's happening year on year going forward.
That will be extremely useful, I think, to have those comparison points over time, and hopefully we will start to see some progress. And then maybe Leanne, just passing this one over to yourself as well, given your kind of focus on intersectionality and things.
Yeah, no, I think one of the other issues, just to kind of complement Noreen's point, is that element of fear, the element of fear of really doubling down and committing. From my perspective, it is about women, but with the intersectional lens, it's also looking at what does it mean to be a Black woman within financial services? What does that look like? Not just from the perspective of leadership, which is the oft-touted perspective, we want more leaders, which is great, and that should absolutely be the eventuality. But in the meantime, what do we do about entry level, junior management? And it is that concept of whataboutism, having to still kind of overcome understanding the structure of the corporate world. And it's not always being about finger pointing, but rather understanding that we're all a byproduct of the same systems, and some of us are disadvantaged and some of us are advantaged by it. So I think, as I think both Dominie and Mark said, the conversations are being had, but now it's almost, we have to get to that point where we're really willing to put our money where our mouth is, to say we want to reach XYZ outcome, and also with intentionality. And that also means having the right people. And when I say the right people, the representatives in the room, but them also being able to A, be free to speak, and then C, being able to kind of influence change, which is sometimes a difficulty. It's great having me at the table, but can I actually change anything going forward? And I think that's where, for a lot of people, we're having the bottleneck and the rub, is that they might be in the room, but how much does their vote count for?
That's really insightful. Thank you. And it leads us quite nicely into the next question as well, around awareness. So I think everyone's touched on, that this is being discussed a lot across the industry, with respect to leadership, with respect to data and all that kind of thing. But, and a lot of the efforts are around awareness. I'd be quite keen to understand a little bit more from each of you, how do we get that diversity, that awareness translated into concrete action and to see some of this progress? Maybe if I could start with yourself, Noreen.
Sure, and I think one of the reasons Reboot came about was because we did want to raise awareness through storytelling, because I feel like that emotional resonance lingers a lot longer than those very high level statistics. And we talk about diversity and inclusion like it's something very fluffy and nice to have, but you need to also appreciate the flip side of it. The flip side of it is microaggressions, it's racism, it's sexism, it's what is impeding individuals and their ability to go further in their careers and other parts of life. So these are very serious issues, and I think people are just not comfortable to confront these issues, let alone talk about them. So yes, awareness is important, because the more we tell these stories, the more we can talk about it, be more comfortable about it. But I think that's only just one component of a very large and complex societal issue, and that requires a range of solutions. So yes, awareness, but it's also, you're going to add in the training, the policies, the quota, the data disclosure, which I earlier mentioned, and actually regulation to start completing that bigger picture. And that's when these stories can then start translating into these very actionable real change.
Fantastic, thank you. And Leanne, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Noreen summarized it beautifully, and I'd also say I think this is the key point. Once again, going back to mentioning representation and the ability to influence change, which is we're talking about a lot of solutions, and I think ultimately we can look at it from a DEI perspective, which is an umbrella term, but we have to start being very specific as towards the solutions we need for minoritized groups, marginalized groups, women, age, sex. We can't just look for a one size fits all. And as much as we keep saying we need specific solutions, we're still talking in macro terms, and we have to start talking in micro terms, but also making sure that the main drivers in terms of people behind these processes and solutions are looking at it from what I believe is really important, is from a co-creational perspective, where we combine lived experience with strategic experience to then find fitting solutions. Because without co-creation, it's still us speculating as to how we can help, when actually it might be well-intentioned, but we have to move past well-intentions and actually to, solutions that help short-term, mid-term and long-term.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree. And Mark, what's your view there?
Yeah, I think there's obviously some great points that have been made so far, and I wholeheartedly agree with them. One thing that worries me about this question is, why is awareness important? I think we've been talking about this and making people aware of this for a long time now. We talk about this being a business imperative. We talk about it being the right thing to do. Governments and regulators are pushing us to do more. But in reality, a lot of the things that we do on a daily basis, recruitment, for example, we haven't fundamentally changed the way that we recruit. 90% of hires are still made and done in the same old way that they always were, which mostly turns up male candidates for those roles. Promotions are still done in the same way as we used to do them. And we just need to start thinking differently and acting more radically to really start moving the dial and accelerating change towards the end. I think it's okay creating awareness, but we need to facilitate change. The other thing I'd say in terms of awareness is the vast majority of people in power within our industry are straight white men, people who frankly look like me. And we're not aware of our male privilege, our relative advantage, the advantages we've got as men in this environment, and how our accidental sexisms really affect, and accidental racisms affect people within minority groups within the organisation that we work for. And we do need to become aware of those. We do need to, having become aware of them, change the way we behave, our values, to give voice and opportunity to women within the industry and people from different backgrounds.
Fantastic, thank you. And Dominie, anything you would add?
Well, I mean, I completely agree with everyone on the panel, and there's been obviously some very, very excellent comments. I think just in terms of thinking about awareness, perhaps in a slightly different way, in terms of leaders of businesses being aware of what is going on in their own organizations in terms of the structure and the culture and the policies of how things get done that are in direct competition with their sort of stated objectives around, building a more diverse workforce. And I am constantly surprised by how unaware, very senior people are in their organizations about the real nitty gritty nuts and bolts about how people are hired, how they're promoted, and why they leave. There's lots of assumptions that people make about particularly why women leave their careers, because it's all they want to have children and they don't want to work, they want to work part-time, which is a load of nonsense. And also particularly how people bring in individuals into their organization. As Mark said, a lot of the very traditional recruitment methods are still the main ways that people are brought into an organization. And I think you layer that with the kind of overall kind of industrialization of recruitment processes that have happened over the last 20 years, enabled in many ways by, tech and things like LinkedIn. Recruitment has sort of been boiled down to a kind of cost per hire, time to hire model. It's all about, saving money and creating efficiencies. And unfortunately, what that does is it allows a certain kind of individual to move much more frictionlessly through their career than everyone else. And the kind of candidates that have perhaps non-standard backgrounds, for whatever reason, particularly obviously in my field of experience, returners who've had career breaks. But actually, we know that many, in particular, women's careers have been, they've described more like a jungle gym than a ladder. So they sort of tend to be a bit more squiggly well, actually there's a brilliant company called Squiggly Careers, or a brilliant book called Squiggly Careers, all about, the sort of non-linear career path that many women have. And these people are basically screened out of traditional recruitment processes. And not because they're not brilliant candidates, they are, and they've got actually very often acquired new skills and new networks and new experiences that would be of huge value to any organization. But those traditional methods of recruitment, which is all about who's in the role doing the same job somewhere else, don't find these individuals. And I think just another point to make on that is the level of investment that companies make into hiring from this mainly 80% male pool of candidates. Companies spend millions and millions of pounds every year investing, if you like, in targeting this relatively homogenous group of candidates. The level of investment that they make in hiring from the other candidate pools, certainly the sort of returner pool, but also in other ways of attracting diverse talent, is a fraction of that. And I think that needs to be addressed.
Victoria, do you mind if I come in there? Because Dominie, your points there were amazing and well put across. In a market, in a talent pool that is 80% male and 20% female, attracting that 20% female to even be involved in a recruitment process, to put their heads above the parapet when they know that they're going to have a really poor lived experience of that process, is also things that firms need to consider. You need to change the way you recruit to get to that 20%, and not just do things quickly and cheaply through an industrialized process. Your points were brilliant.
Yeah, and Dominie, if I could add to that as well, because it really chimed with me, because there was a few, anecdotally, a lot of the ethnic minorities that we've sort of interviewed over the past, they leave the industry, but no one is really talking about it. But they're saying when you really ask them the questions, they're leaving because they don't feel like they fit in. They have no cultural fit. And they weren't getting anywhere with their career. They kept on reaching this glass ceiling. So they opted to set up their own businesses, completely change industries, or, but they're not saying it out loud because it's so instilled there. They're just like, oh, it wasn't for me. But after, those 2 or 3 questions, actually, there's a huge cultural issue where they're just moving out and they don't question it. And that scares me a little bit, because no one's picking up on that. We're not, and how can you fix it if we're not gathering that information and trying to fix these big cultural issues? So it's very much the same as you were talking about the female issue versus, ethnic minorities on the cultural piece as well.
And if you don't mind me just chiming in what Dominie said, which was a really key point, is this is where, and I think this is the part that companies have to start getting to grips with, that an equitable process, be it hiring, promotion, leadership training. Equity takes time. Equity isn't short. It's not painless. It's discovering where the rubs are. It's discovering how do we do it. It's being told that your culture potentially stinks, that your leadership isn't so great. And it means having hard conversations. But this is the only way we can get to this point of equity, in understanding what is it that is preventing progress for women, for minoritized groups, for marginalized groups. Because until we have an equitable conversation, an equitable practice, we can talk diversity, we can talk inclusion, but the equity in the middle is the bit that really supports both. And I think that's the important part for the whole process. We can't forget this equity piece.
Agree. Yeah. And I think you're right. Equity is normally missed out when we say it's diversity and inclusion, but actually the equity piece is so important and different to equal. And it's really understanding those nuances. 100% agree.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, everyone, and agree. I think we'll be hearing a lot more about the equity piece. Historically, that certainly hasn't been as prominent in the discussions. And I guess we've touched on the sort of where we are now as an industry and what companies are and aren't doing and what they may need to do. I'm just wondering, though, in your work with these organisations, what's driving them at the moment? What kind of drivers are, obviously, I think, Dominie, you mentioned at the beginning the regulatory focus and things like that, but what are you seeing there? And is there any correlation between the driver and the outcomes that you're seeing?
Sorry, do I go?
Yes, please. Yeah. Sorry.
So I think there are a number of drivers. Obviously, policy from government is one, gender pay gap, women in finance charter. But I think, there is a moral imperative here that is, that is a big driver here, and that's being driven from a certain kind of leader, but also employees. And, companies are more and more aware of how important their brand is in attracting the best talent. So, companies understand that if they want to attract, particularly Generation Z, but across the generations, really, the very best talent, they need to be demonstrating that they are the kind of employer where these individuals can see themselves thrive and succeed and climb up the ladder for everybody, not just a certain type of individual. I think shareholders as well, there's investors and external stakeholders, clients who are asking more of their counterparties, what are you doing about diversity? Turning up to pitch for a mandate with a group of people who look the same. People are they're losing business when they do that. We're hearing these kind of stories. Investors are asking more of their fund managers. If you want us to give us your money and invest in your funds, you need to really demonstrate what you're doing on diversity. And that doesn't mean just setting a target anymore or sponsoring an event. It means actually reporting to us on, for example, how many female fund managers do you have? And, how do you bring people into your organization? So I think there's lots of different drivers. I'm sure I've missed some, but I think those are the ones that really, I would say that, are pretty important.
And maybe if I open that to the rest of you as well, is there anything you would add there?
Yeah, from a race and ethnicity perspective, I would say, steps are being taken to embed, diversity, equity and inclusion into the workplace. But if you look at the US, for example, I do think the UK is a lot more behind. But I think the BLM movement, it had a universal effect. And there's these transformational forces behind ESG at the moment. And as Dominie's just said, you've got Gen Z entering the workplace, and they're more about social impact as opposed to job for life or compensation, etc. And then you've got the millennials that are now taking on these leadership, these senior roles. So we are actually seeing this huge shift. And I've definitely noticed it over the last couple of years, and that's really helping change that mentality. But these drivers, they're not, you're not going to notice these changes overnight. It's going to take time. So we still need conversations like this and all these grassroots types of groups to really be that catalyst to ensure, these things are happening. And as for Dominie's point, there's some great things that have happened from a gender diversity perspective. And, there's a lot that we can learn from it, like the gender pay gap report. We should be seeing that with ethnicity pay gap reporting as well, and bringing in other sorts of regulations. So we shouldn't be waiting as long as we had to do for all the gender stuff that we've seen today. Like, we should use them as case studies and really be a lot faster in implementing them.
And I would also say that, outside of, let's say, the usual professional pressures, I think social media is having a huge effect in terms of mistreatment of employees, whether it's, posting. There was some things that I saw on Twitter about certain asset managers and racist things happening there. And I think whilst to Noreen's point, people aren't necessarily comfortable being a face and explaining why they're leaving companies, but there is now this a heightened level of employee activism, which is, I'm not going to sit back anymore and let myself be overlooked. I'm going to speak it out. And when I do that, then it highlights usually one of the largest problems that companies have are whistleblowing processes and procedures, and how inequitable they actually are. And in many cases, it's, well, what do we do now? Because it's not always that companies are necessarily always looking for help. Sometimes they're looking to find someone to help them get themselves out of a sticky situation in the initial phase, and then kind of retrofit how they can change their process. But there's a lot more employee-driven power that I don't think we've had before, because we didn't have the pandemic where everybody's on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram all the time, where we're fed with the latest and breaking news as to what companies made a mistake. And it's that general level of, I am, as an employee, I am valued, my opinion has value, and I'm no longer going to hide behind what years ago would have got me fired, because if you try to fire me today for the same thing, hell hath no fury than, the whole group of everybody here and everyone that stands behind us. So I think there is a lot of change in the way we are as individuals, how we're being a value-based, value-driven society is pushing how companies themselves have to not just state their values, but also live their values.
Yeah, and Leanne, can I jump off your bandwagon? And I love that, and I love how you say employee activism, and I totally hear that. And actually, there's some really big financial services firms that obviously I won't name, but they had exactly this issue. Like, there is a reputational issue behind it, and actually it can impact your share price, quite frankly. So we've got to stop thinking this is a fluffy topic, because these drivers are huge now, and actually it can really impact your bottom line. And I just think, Leanne, you just put it beautifully there, just talking about how social media has really impacted that.
Thank you.
I think it's thrive or survive. It's, if not now, when. And don't ask how much it's going to cost you to do it. How much is it going to cost you not to do it? To sum that up, I think the winners of tomorrow will be inclusive leaders, inclusive firms, who, as you say, are offering equity, diversity, inclusion, are just as part of their culture, as part of the way they go about things. Let's move forward like that.
That's a wonderful way to wrap that particular part of the discussion up. But so thank you, everyone. So some really useful points raised there. And I guess moving on to a related point around how individuals and what they can do with respect to some of the things we've talked about. Could we touch a little bit on effective allyship and what that looks like, and how the people within the organisations we're talking about can sort of start to really bring about some of this change? Maybe Leanne, if I come to you first on that point.
For sure. I think the first thing is realizing that we all have the capacity to be allies. It's not somebody else's problem. It's not for someone else to do. It's not for the leaders of the firm to always be the drivers behind it, but that we can all actively play a role. We can all do. The question is, are you willing to? The best allies are those who are willing to embrace their own discomfort to go a bit further. It's not always about, trying to become an ally and get the t-shirt, get the mug, but rather to listen and center the needs of others who you're trying to genuinely help. So it's not always about, can I ask you this question because I want to know, but rather, can we talk about this so we can exchange so that I can appreciate my position and where I'm potentially not seeing what I have, versus how can I then help you? How can I amplify your voice? Because ultimately, I think sometimes in the conversations around allyship, we forget that the purpose of it is to amplify the voices of those who aren't in the room, who aren't present, and keeping that front and center. It's not about what am I doing? It's about putting your own discomfort aside and saying, what is the outcome I'm hoping to achieve for the person who's potentially not in the room and I have a voice there? So like for me, that's the main one. It's like not anyone else's responsibility, but we all have our individual roles to play.
And
shall I come in next?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I think it's really important, in all of our organisations, the people at the top, in the top few layers, are predominantly straight white men. And as straight white men, when we were talking about diversity, it wasn't about us, it was about everybody else. And we were perhaps rightly excluded from the conversation. Now we're talking about equity and we're talking about inclusion. It is very much about us and everybody else. It's about us doing things together. But we have to understand as straight white men that actually, in many ways, the culture is us. We set the culture, we set the behaviors, we set the values, because we're at the top of the organization and we are the majority. And in doing that, we need to open our eyes, one, to our relative advantage that gives us, but also then to how our accidental sexisms and our accidental racisms, which we have because we're human, actually affect and inhibit the progress of people from other groups. As soon as we recognize those three things, we start to change. And we can then stand up and be called out, an offer to be called out, invite people to call us out, and invite people to call other people out when these accidental behaviors happen. I have a slight problem with the word allyship as well. Allyship tends to, in a lot of people, conjure up this sort of knight in shining armor, coming in and doing this one good deed and then leaving. I think, as soon as we realize that it's all about accidental sexisms and accidental racisms, things that happen day in, day out, small little things, we can overcome those big things. But change is about changing these small things that happen day in and day out in the workplace and in wider society.
And to follow on from Mark and Leanne over here, I just think, from my perspective, correct, everyone should be an ally, or however we want to sort of define them. But I think if I Reboot, we're about to launch a report on allyship, so I won't give away all the secrets right now. But I think the one thing that really resonated with me was when we were speaking to the decision makers, the senior leaders, where the idea of sponsorship was quite effective, where one CEO mentioned that he sponsors people within the workforce to make sure that they get the right backing, they get an expansion of their roles, and it's almost he's almost accountable to ensure that they are promoted and they get to their career journey, because he said he's noticed anecdotally again that women have imposter syndrome, but if you see ethnic minorities seem to have a greater sense of imposter syndrome in the sense of their abilities versus their confidence. There's a mismatch there, and it's that education that like what he's picked up, and he's been able to act on it, and that really did resonate with me, because in fact he's helped these individuals grow in their career, and without that sponsorship, like where would they be? And I think that to me was just like a very effective, but something that really stood out that's not really been discussed in much detail, and I think it deserves a bit more recognition, because it's obviously incredibly impactful for the individual.
Yeah, fantastic. And just I guess conscious that we are coming towards the end of the session. One thing I did want to touch on, and we've talked about senior leaders and what individuals can do, but just around this accountability question. So could I maybe ask the panelists just in maybe a sentence or two that their views on how accountability for DE&I is most effectively allocated?
Victoria, thanks. I think in the past, DE&I activities have been championed and have been the domain of people from those underrepresented groups. And going forward, that can't be the case. Accountability has got to start at the top. It's at the top where most of the change has got to happen. If it starts there, it's then got to waterfall down through the whole organisation. We've all got to be accountable for it. We've all got to be inclusionist first aiders, if you like, to call out, to spot, to support all of our colleagues, to ensure that their lived experiences are the same as ours or better, that their opportunities are the same as ours, and recognise everybody as an individual.
Great, thank you. And Dominie, is there anything that you would add to that?
I would agree. I think to some extent everyone is accountable, aren't they, for playing their part and making sure that they are aware of what's happening in their own organisations and what they can do as individuals. I mean, it can seem like such a mountain to climb sometimes. I know I definitely sometimes feel like I'm pushing water uphill. It feels like an enormous challenge, but I think, that doesn't mean to say that we all can't make a difference if we're all doing small, even sometimes small things. If everyone's saying small things, they can all add up to making a big change. But you've got to be committed and persistent and continue with it and stick with it. And it's difficult. This is really, 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 really tough. As we it's difficult. I think fundamentally, leadership drives culture. So, that's the top of the tree. They have to be the most accountable to kind of be driving that message and modeling the right behavior and really understanding that actually this is difficult. I had a conversation this week with a potential client who started off saying to me, the chief executive is open to hiring women. Like, right, okay. And then they said, but he thinks it's going to be really difficult. And I was just thinking, if you're not up for difficult, then, don't bother. This is difficult. If you're not up for that, then,
Yeah, I think that is a good note as well to go into our quick fire. I'm conscious we've got about 1 minute left. So could I ask you, each of you, I'll work across the screen. So maybe Leanne, if we come to you first, could you all give me kind of in one sentence what you would ask for those attending the call today to take away from this session?
That was a quick fire one. Wow. Okay, so that would be, in any which way you can, push your companies to take action. Find the ways. If there's any place that you see inconsistencies and you feel comfortable, talk to your managers, but get involved. Just to Dominie's point, we're all accountable. We can all make a change. So find a way to meaningfully get involved is the only thing I can think of, even though I don't want to say like a lot more, but I'm going to stop.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Noreen, one sentence?
I would say Reboot is open for everybody because we're all part of the solution. So if you want to be a Reboot ambassador, ally, please just get in touch. And it's okay to be, uncomfortable with these discussions, but we really want you to be part of this community and speak up with us.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Dominie?
Keep going. That's what I wanted to say. Keep going, keep going, keep going. I know sometimes it feels tough, but yeah, just don't give up and keep the faith.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Mark?
Thank you. I think we should recognise the huge strides that we've made. I've been working now for 40 years, actually over 40 years, and the workplace, society, our world is a very different and a much better place now than it was 40 years ago. And actually, in that perspective, on that timeline, we're near the end of the journey now. There's not that far to go, but the only way we're going to get to that finishing line is if we all join hands together and let's dash to that finishing line where we all want to be, which is a better world, a better workplace for everybody.
Fantastic. And on that note, a massive thanks to the four of you for sharing some very powerful messages. And thank you very much to everyone watching. I think you have a break in your agenda now. So please go grab a cup of coffee and enjoy the next session. Take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Thanks, everyone.